Someone just ruined your morning. A comment, a look, a message. 5 minutes of negativity from someone else, and your entire day shifted. Your mood dropped. Your energy drained. Your peace disappeared. And the worst part? They're not even thinking about you anymore. They moved on. But you're still affected. Still bothered. Still giving them power over your emotional state. This ends today. Right now, while you're watching this, understand something critical. Every time you let something or someone affect your emotional state, you've handed them control over your life. Every reaction you have to external events is a confession that external events own you. Every time your peace depends on circumstances going your way, you've made yourself a slave to circumstances. But what if nothing could affect you anymore? What if people's opinions became background noise? What if disappointments became meaningless? What if you developed complete immunity to external chaos? What if you became psychologically untouchable? 500 years ago, Niccolò Machiavelli watched men destroy themselves not through enemy attacks, but through their own inability to remain unaffected. Leaders who crumbled when criticized, warriors who panicked when plans changed, advisors who collapsed when rejected. He documented a truth that most people still don't understand. The strongest fortress isn't external walls. It's internal invincibility. Today, you're going to learn the ultimate Machiavellian freedom. Not escaping from life, but becoming immune to its chaos. Not avoiding challenges, but transcending their power to disturb you. Not suppressing emotions, but achieving sovereignty over your emotional state. This knowledge will transform you from someone constantly affected by external forces into someone completely untouchable by them. But I need you to understand something before we begin. This isn't about becoming cold, heartless, or disconnected. This is about becoming powerful, centered, and free. It's about caring deeply about what matters while becoming immune to what doesn't. It's about choosing your emotional responses instead of having them chosen for you. Now, drop this affirmation in the comments. Nothing controls my peace. This isn't just a comment. This is your declaration of emotional sovereignty. From this moment forward, you decide what affects you and what doesn't. Let's begin your transformation into someone nothing and nobody can affect again. Number 1, the dependency trap. Here's the brutal truth nobody wants to hear. Every emotional reaction you have reveals a dependency. When someone's opinion affects you, you're dependent on their approval. When criticism bothers you, you're dependent on validation. When rejection hurts you, you're dependent on acceptance. When circumstances disturb you, you're dependent on control. These dependencies are invisible chains. You don't see them because you've worn them your entire life. But they're there, connecting your internal state to external factors, making you vulnerable to anything and anyone that touches those chains. Think about your last emotional reaction. Someone said something that made you angry, hurt, anxious, or upset. In that moment, they proved they could control your emotional state. They pushed a button and got a predictable response. That button exists because of dependency. You depend on them treating you a certain way, speaking to you respectfully, validating your worth, or meeting your expectations. When they don't, the dependency gets violated and you react emotionally. This is the trap. The more dependencies you have, the more vulnerable you are. The more things that can affect you, the less powerful you become. You've essentially distributed pieces of your emotional sovereignty to external factors, making your peace conditional on things you can't control. Machiavelli once wrote, "The prince who relies entirely on fortune is lost when it changes." He wasn't just talking about luck or circumstances. He was talking about dependency, the ruler who depends on others for. Power loses power when others withdraw support. The person who depends on externals for peace loses peace when externals shift. Here's what most people don't realize. You were trained into these dependencies. From childhood, you learned that external validation meant you were good. External criticism meant you were bad. Others' happiness meant you were worthy. Others' disappointment meant you failed. Every emotional dependency you have now was programmed through years of conditioning. Your parents, teachers, society, culture, all taught you to tie your emotional state to external factors. Be happy when praised. Be hurt when criticized. Be anxious when uncertain. Be angry when disrespected. This created a psychological architecture where your emotional state is constantly at the mercy of external events. You're like a boat without an anchor, moved by every wave, affected by every current, controlled by forces outside yourself. But here's the profound realization that changes everything. These dependencies aren't real. They're learned. And what's learned can be unlearned. The connection between external events and your emotional state isn't hardwired. It's a habit, a pattern, a conditioning that can be broken. Right now, make a list in your mind. What external factors affect your emotional state? Whose opinions matter too much? Which circumstances disturb your peace? What situations trigger automatic reactions? Every item on that list is a dependency. Every dependency is a vulnerability. Every vulnerability is a point of control that external forces have over your internal state. This awareness is the first step to freedom. You can't break chains you don't know exist. You can't eliminate dependencies you haven't identified. You can't achieve emotional sovereignty until you recognize where you've given that sovereignty away. Machiavelli understood that self-knowledge precedes self-mastery. Before you can rule yourself, you must understand yourself. Before you can become unaffected, you must see clearly what currently affects you. For the next 3 days, practice dependency awareness. Every time something affects your emotional state, pause and identify the dependency. What am I depending on here? What expectation is being violated? What need is going unmet? What control am I trying to maintain? This isn't about judging yourself. It's about seeing clearly. Because once you see the dependencies, you can begin the process of eliminating them. And once the dependencies are gone, nothing external can affect you anymore. Your peace becomes unconditional, your strength becomes unshakable, your sovereignty becomes absolute. Drop this in the comments. I see my dependencies clearly. Number 2, emotional sovereignty. Here's the lie you've been living. You think other people make you feel things. He made me angry. She hurt my feelings. They disappointed me. This situation stressed me out. Every time you use this language, you're confessing that you're not in control of your emotional state. You're admitting that external factors have sovereignty over your internal experience. But here's the truth that will set you free. Nobody makes you feel anything. Nothing makes you feel anything. You feel things because of how you interpret and respond to what happens. The same event happens to 2 people. One person is devastated. Another person is unaffected. The event didn't create the emotion. The response to the event created the emotion. And response is always a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Think about this carefully. Someone insults you. Do you automatically feel hurt? No. First, you interpret the insult. You decide it matters. You believe it reflects truth. You give the person authority to define you. Then, based on all these interpretations and beliefs, you feel hurt. The hurt isn't caused by the insult. It's caused by your entire psychological response to the insult. Someone with different interpretations and beliefs experiences the same insult without any hurt at all. This is emotional sovereignty. Understanding that your emotional state is your responsibility, your creation, your domain. External events are just events. They have no inherent emotional content until you give them meaning, and meaning is something you assign, not something that exists objectively. Machiavelli once observed, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." What he meant is that most people live in interpretation, not reality. They respond to their perception of events, not to events themselves. And perception is always internal, always chosen, always within your control. Here's how to practice emotional sovereignty. When something happens that would normally affect you, pause. Before the automatic emotional reaction kicks in, insert a moment of conscious awareness. In that pause, recognize this fundamental truth. This event is neutral. I'm about to assign it meaning. I'm about to choose my response. I'm about to decide whether this affects me. That pause is where your power lives. In the gap between stimulus and response. Most people have no gap. Something happens and they react automatically. But you're going to create that gap deliberately. Something happens. You pause. You choose. You respond consciously. This is sovereignty. Let me give you a practical framework. When an event occurs, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what story am I telling myself about this event? Notice that it's a story, an interpretation, not objective reality. Someone didn't respond to your message. The story might be they're ignoring me. They don't value me. I'm not important. But that's just a story. The fact is simply that they didn't respond. The story is your creation. Second, what would I need to believe for this event to affect me? Usually, You'd need to believe that their response determines your worth, that you need their validation, that their behavior reflects truth about you. These beliefs are optional. You can choose not to believe them. Third, what response serves my emotional sovereignty? Not what response feels automatic or justified. What response maintains your internal power? Sometimes that's expressing yourself calmly. Sometimes it's complete indifference. Sometimes it's removing yourself from the situation entirely. The key is that you're choosing based on sovereignty, not reacting based on dependency. Machiavelli wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." But the deeper wisdom is this. The first method for estimating someone's power is to look at what affects them. The person affected by everything is weak. The person affected by nothing is invincible. Now here's where this gets truly transformative. Emotional sovereignty isn't just about not being affected negatively. It's about choosing your emotional state regardless of external circumstances. You don't just avoid being hurt, angry, or anxious. You actively choose to be peaceful, centered, and strong no matter what's happening around you. This is the difference between defensive sovereignty and offensive sovereignty. Defensive is not letting bad things affect you. Offensive is choosing good states regardless of circumstances. Most people only attempt defensive sovereignty, and even that incompletely. But true masters practice offensive sovereignty. The world can be chaos, and they choose peace. People can be hostile, and they choose compassion. Circumstances can be difficult, and they choose strength. Their emotional state isn't reactive to externals. It's generative from internals. This requires understanding a profound principle. Your emotional state is not a response to reality. It's a choice about how to meet reality. Reality is neutral. Your state is chosen. When you fully internalize this, you achieve complete emotional sovereignty. Nothing external has power over your internal experience because you recognize that internal experience is always self-created. You might think this makes you cold or disconnected. The opposite is true. When you're not constantly affected by external chaos, you can engage with life more fully. You can care deeply without being dependent. You can love without being vulnerable. You can participate without being controlled. Sovereignty isn't isolation. It's freedom within connection. Here's your practice for the next week. Every morning, before external events begin affecting you, choose your emotional state. I choose peace today. I choose strength today. I choose centeredness today. Then, when events occur that would normally disturb that chosen state, you have a reference point. Oh, something is trying to move me away from my chosen state. I noticed that. I choose to maintain my state regardless. This practice transforms your relationship with emotions. They stop being things that happen to you and become things you create and maintain. You stop being a victim of external forces and become the sovereign ruler of your internal kingdom. Drop this affirmation. I am emotionally sovereign. My state is my choice. Number 3, the invincibility practice. Here's what most people get wrong about becoming unaffected. They think it's about avoiding things that bother them, hiding from criticism, eliminating challenges, creating a perfect life where nothing goes wrong. This is weakness disguised as strategy. True invincibility isn't built by avoiding what affects you. It's built by exposing yourself to what affects you until it no longer does. Like a vaccine uses controlled exposure to build immunity, you use deliberate practice to build psychological invincibility. Machiavelli understood this principle deeply. He wrote about how princes must experience adversity to develop the strength needed for leadership. Soft times create soft men. Hard times create hard men. But here's the genius application. You don't wait for hard times to arrive randomly. You create controlled hard times deliberately. This is the invincibility practice. Systematic exposure to things that would normally affect you, done intentionally in low-stakes environments, building psychological antibodies that protect you when stakes are high. Think about how athletes train. They don't avoid physical stress. They seek it deliberately in practice so their bodies adapt and become stronger. The same principle applies to psychological strength. You don't avoid emotional stress. You seek it deliberately in practice so your mind adapts and becomes invincible. Here's how to implement this systematically. First, identify what currently affects you most. Make a hierarchy from mildest triggers to strongest. Maybe mild criticism barely bothers you, but harsh rejection devastates you. Maybe small disappointments are manageable, but major failures destroy you. This hierarchy becomes your training program. You start with the mildest triggers and deliberately expose yourself to them. Not in real high-stakes situations, but in controlled practice environments where consequences are minimal. Let's say criticism affects you. Start practicing with extremely mild criticism in situations that don't matter. Ask someone to give you feedback on something trivial. When they do, practice remaining completely unaffected. Notice the impulse to defend, explain, or feel hurt. Observe that impulse without acting on it. Let it arise and pass without letting it disturb your center. This is the training. Each time you experience the trigger without being affected, you're building immunity. Your nervous system learns that this trigger isn't actually dangerous. Your psychology adapts to remain stable despite the stimulus. Over time, what used to affect you simply doesn't anymore. But here's the critical detail. You must practice consistently and progressively. Just like you can't build physical strength with one workout, you can't build psychological invincibility with one practice session. This is a systematic program of exposure, adaptation, and growth. Start with what affects you slightly and practice until it doesn't affect you at all. Then move to what affects you moderately and repeat the process. Gradually work your way up the hierarchy until even your strongest triggers become powerless. Machiavelli once wrote, "Where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great." What he meant is that committed practice overcomes any obstacle. If you're willing to systematically expose yourself to what affects you, you will inevitably build immunity to it. Here's a specific protocol you can start today. Choose one thing that affects you mildly. Maybe someone's tone of voice, a particular type of comment, a specific situation that creates slight discomfort. For the next 7 days, deliberately expose yourself to that trigger at least once daily. Seek out situations where it might occur. When it does, practice your sovereignty response. Notice the trigger. Observe your impulse to react. Choose to remain unaffected. Track your progress. Day 1. Maybe the trigger still bothers you significantly. Day 3. Maybe it bothers you less. Day 7. Maybe it barely registers. This progression is immunity building in real time. Now here's where advanced practitioners take this further. They don't just practice with real triggers. They use visualization to practice with imagined triggers. Before sleep each night, visualize scenarios that would normally affect you. See them in vivid detail. Feel the impulse to react. Then practice remaining completely centered and unaffected in the visualization. This mental rehearsal is incredibly powerful. Your nervous system can't fully distinguish between real and vividly imagined experiences. When you practice staying unaffected in imagination, you're training the same neural pathways you'd use in reality. Athletes do this constantly, visualizing performance under pressure so that actual pressure feels familiar and manageable. You're doing the same thing with emotional triggers. The goal isn't to eliminate all emotional response. It's to eliminate automatic affected states. You can still choose to care about things that matter. You can still choose to respond to things strategically. The difference is that nothing affects you against your will. You're never disturbed unless you choose to be disturbed. Think about the most unshakable people you've encountered. They weren't born that way. They built that invincibility through experience, often through surviving things that would have destroyed others. But you don't need to wait for random trauma. You can systematically create controlled challenges that build the same strength without the same cost. Machiavelli observed that fortune is the arbiter of half our actions, but she still leaves us to direct the other half. You can't control what life throws at you, but you can control how prepared you are when it does. The invincibility practice is how you prepare. Every day you practice remaining unaffected by small things. You're preparing for when big things arrive. Every time you choose sovereignty over reactivity in low-stakes situations, you're strengthening the neural pathways you'll need in high-stakes situations. Here's your commitment for the next 30 days. Choose one category of trigger. Maybe it's criticism, rejection, disappointment, uncertainty, or disrespect. For 30 days, deliberately seek exposure to mild versions of that trigger. Practice your sovereignty response every single time. Document your progress. Notice how what affected you on day 1 barely registers by day 30. This is proof that being affected isn't permanent or inevitable. It's a pattern that can be changed through deliberate practice. And when you've built immunity to one category of trigger, you move to the next. Over time, you systematically eliminate every external factor's power to affect you without your permission. This is how you become truly invincible. Not by hiding from what could hurt you, but by building immunity to it through controlled exposure and consistent practice. Drop this in the comments. I am building invincibility daily. Number 4, strategic indifference. Here's a truth that will transform how you experience life. You cannot care about everything equally. Your attention is finite. Your emotional energy is limited. Your capacity to be affected is a resource that gets depleted. When you care about everything, you become exhausted, overwhelmed, and powerless. When you care about nothing, you become empty, disconnected, and purposeless. But when you care strategically about what truly matters while becoming indifferent to what doesn't, you become invincible. This is strategic indifference. Not the absence of caring, but the deliberate allocation of caring only to what deserves it. Most people make a critical mistake. They allow external events to determine what they care about. Something loud gets their attention. Something urgent demands their energy. Something provocative triggers their reaction. They're constantly responding to whatever grabs them, rather than deliberately choosing what deserves their response. This makes them weak. When you react to everything, you have energy for nothing important. When everything affects you, nothing gets your full attention. When you care about what doesn't matter, you can't care effectively about what does. Machiavelli once wrote, "A wise ruler ought never to keep faith, when by doing so it would be against his interests." People misunderstand this as advocating betrayal. What he actually meant is that wise people don't waste resources on things that don't serve their ultimate purpose. Applied to emotional energy, this means don't waste caring on things that don't matter. Don't let your emotional state be affected by trivialities. Don't give attention to noise when signal requires your focus. Here's the framework for strategic indifference. Divide everything in your life into 3 categories. Category 1, worthy of deep care. These are your core values, your genuine relationships, your meaningful goals, your authentic purpose. Maybe 5 to 10 things total that truly matter to your life's direction and quality. For these things, you care completely. You invest fully. You allow yourself to be affected when necessary because they deserve that level of engagement. Category 2, neutral territory. These are the vast majority of things in life. Most conversations, most events, most circumstances, most people, most situations. They're not bad, but they're not deeply significant either. For these things, you practice pleasant indifference. You engage appropriately, but don't allow emotional investment. You participate without being affected. You're present without being attached. Category 3, active indifference. These are provocations, distractions, manipulations, and noise deliberately designed to affect you or waste your energy. Criticism from people whose opinion doesn't matter. Drama from people who feed on your reaction. Problems that aren't actually your responsibility. Circumstances you cannot control. For these things, you practice conscious indifference. You actively refuse to be affected. You deliberately choose not to care. You protect your emotional energy by denying these things any access to it. Now here's what's powerful about this framework. When you clearly categorize everything, you stop wasting energy on things that don't deserve it. You stop being affected by category 2 and 3 items, which frees enormous amounts of emotional energy to invest in category 1 items that actually matter. Think about your last week. How much emotional energy did you spend on things that won't matter a month from now? How often were you affected by circumstances in category 2 or 3? How much of your peace was disturbed by things that don't deserve that power over you? Most people waste 90% of their emotional energy on things that deserve 0% of it. This makes them exhausted, reactive, and powerless when things that truly matter require their full attention. Strategic indifference is how you reclaim that energy. But here's where people struggle. They fear that indifference makes them cold, uncaring, or disconnected. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Strategic indifference isn't about caring less overall. It's about caring more effectively by caring selectively. When you stop wasting emotional energy on what doesn't matter, you have more to invest in what does. When you stop being affected by trivial things, you can be fully present for important things. When you practice indifference to noise, you can hear signal clearly. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous enemy is wasted resources. Not external attack, but internal waste. Every moment you spend affected by something insignificant is a moment stolen from something significant. Every reaction to Category 2 or 3 items is energy that could have been invested in Category 1 items. Here's how to practice strategic indifference starting today. Before you react to anything, ask yourself one question. Does this deserve my emotional energy? Not does this trigger me? Does this bother me? Does this seem important in the moment? But does this actually deserve the finite resource of my caring? If the answer is no, practice deliberate indifference. Notice the impulse to care. Observe the desire to react. Then consciously choose not to engage emotionally. You might still respond behaviorally if necessary, but without emotional investment. You handle it without being affected by it. Let me give you concrete examples. Someone you barely know criticizes something you did. Category 3. Practice active indifference. You notice the criticism, assess if there's useful information, then release any emotional response. You're completely unaffected because this doesn't deserve your energy. A minor plan changes unexpectedly. Category 2. Practice neutral indifference. You adapt to the change without being disturbed by it. You handle what needs handling without emotional resistance. Someone you deeply love needs your support. Category 1. You engage fully. You care completely. You allow yourself to be present and invested because this matters and deserves your emotional energy. The power is in the deliberate choice. You're not randomly affected by whatever happens. You're strategically choosing what gets access to your emotional state based on what actually matters in your life. Over time, this practice creates enormous freedom. Most things that used to bother you simply don't anymore. Not because you've suppressed emotions, but because you've recognized those things don't deserve emotional investment. You become someone who can walk through chaos unaffected because you're clear about what matters and what doesn't. Machiavelli observed that the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. Strategic indifference is how you recognize traps. When you see clearly what deserves your care and what doesn't, provocations become obvious traps you simply don't enter. The person trying to affect you loses all power because you've already decided they're Category 3. Their attempt doesn't even register as significant enough to respond to emotionally. Here's your practice for the next 2 weeks. At the end of each day, review everything that affected your emotional state. Categorize each item honestly. How many were Category 1 items that deserved your caring? How many were Category 2 or 3 items that wasted your energy? As you become aware of the pattern, you'll naturally start investing energy more strategically. You'll catch yourself being affected by Category 2 or 3 items and choose indifference in real time. Within 2 weeks, you'll notice a dramatic shift. Things that used to bother you significantly now barely register. You have more emotional energy for what truly matters. You're becoming strategically indifferent and therefore genuinely powerful. Drop this affirmation. I care strategically about what deserves it. Number 5. The untouchable identity. Everything we've discussed until now has been technique, practice, strategy, things you do to become less affected. But now we arrive at the ultimate transformation. This isn't about what you do anymore. It's about who you are. The final level of Machiavellian emotional freedom is an identity shift. From someone who tries not to be affected to someone who simply isn't affected. From practicing invincibility to being invincible. From techniques of sovereignty to the state of sovereignty. This is the untouchable identity. Machiavelli wrote about the difference between appearing virtuous and being virtuous. Most people focus on appearing strong while remaining internally weak. They perform confidence while feeling insecurity. They project invincibility while being secretly vulnerable. But true power comes from the internal reality, not the external performance. When you are unaffected at the identity level, you don't need to try to seem unaffected. You simply are. Here's what this identity shift looks like. Right now, when something affects you, you probably think, I shouldn't let this bother me. I need to stay calm. I have to practice not reacting. This is the doing level. You're using techniques to manage your state. But at the identity level, the thought process is completely different. Something happens and you simply observe, that's interesting. It doesn't affect me. Not as an achievement or effort, but as a natural fact of who you are. Like water doesn't try not to be dry. It simply isn't dry. You don't try not to be affected. You simply aren't affected. This shift happens through consistent practice of everything we've covered. You identify your dependencies and eliminate them. You claim emotional sovereignty and exercise it daily. You build invincibility through systematic exposure. You practice strategic indifference until it becomes automatic. And eventually, these practices don't feel like practices anymore. They become your natural operating system. You become someone for whom being unaffected is the default state. Here's the profound psychological principle behind this. Identity is the strongest force in human psychology. You will always act in accordance with how you define yourself. If you see yourself as someone who gets affected by external events, you will continue to be affected no matter how many techniques you learn. But if you see yourself as someone who is fundamentally unaffected, your entire system aligns with that identity. Your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors automatically support that self-definition. This is why affirmations and declarations are powerful when backed by consistent practice. You're not just saying words. You're declaring an identity and then proving it to yourself through action. Every time you practice remaining unaffected, you're gathering evidence for this new identity. Every time you choose sovereignty over reaction, you're reinforcing who you are. Eventually, the evidence becomes overwhelming and the identity shift completes. Machiavelli understood that the greatest leaders weren't those who pretended to be strong. They were those who had become strong through experience and challenge. They didn't perform courage. They were courageous. They didn't fake composure. They were composed. Their power was real because their identity was transformed. You're undergoing the same transformation. From someone who wants to be unaffected, to someone who practices being unaffected, to someone who is unaffected. The final stage is permanent. It's not something you might lose. It's who you've become. Think about the people in your life who are genuinely unshakable. Not the ones performing strength, but the ones who are actually strong. Nothing seems to disturb them. Criticism rolls off them. Disappointment doesn't shake them. Chaos doesn't rattle them. They're not working hard to stay calm. They simply are calm. That's the untouchable identity. And here's what happens when you achieve it. First, people stop trying to affect you. When your unaffected state is obviously genuine, not an act, provocations stop working. Manipulators move on to easier targets. Critics find more reactive audiences. Drama finds more willing participants. You become boring too. People who feed on reactions, which means you become free from their attempts at control. Second, respect increases dramatically. People sense authentic strength. They can't articulate why, but they feel that you're operating from a different level. They treat you differently, more carefully, more respectfully. Not because you demand it, but because your state commands it naturally. Third, your peace becomes unconditional. It's no longer dependent on circumstances being favorable, people being kind, or outcomes going your way. Your peace exists independently of all external factors. Life can be chaotic and you remain centered. People can be difficult and you remain calm. Circumstances can be challenging and you remain strong. This is the ultimate freedom Machiavelli pointed toward. Not freedom from external events, but freedom from being controlled by external events. Not isolation from life, but sovereignty within life. Not avoiding what could affect you, but being someone who cannot be affected. Here's how to complete this identity shift. Start seeing yourself differently right now. Not as someone who is working toward being unaffected, but as someone who already is unaffected and is simply remembering that truth. When something happens that would normally disturb you, instead of thinking I need to stay calm, think I am calm. This isn't who I am anymore. Instead of I shouldn't let this bother me, think this doesn't bother me because I am unaffected. The language shift is crucial. It moves you from aspiration to declaration, from trying to being. And when you declare an identity, your entire psychology mobilizes to make that declaration true. Machiavelli's final wisdom about power was this: everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. Most people will only see your external state, but you experience your internal reality. And that internal reality is what matters most. When your internal reality is genuinely unaffected, the external appearance takes care of itself naturally. You now possess the complete Machiavellian framework for emotional invincibility. You understand the dependency trap and how to escape it. You've claimed emotional sovereignty as your birthright. You've learned the invincibility practice to build immunity through exposure. You've mastered strategic indifference to conserve energy for what matters. And you've discovered the untouchable identity that makes being unaffected your permanent state. But understanding isn't transformation. Knowledge isn't power. Application is power. Starting today, right now, You must implement what you've learned. Not perfectly, not completely, but consistently. Every day, practice one principle. Every interaction, apply one technique. Every challenge, remember one truth. Over time, these practices become automatic. The techniques become natural. The truths become your lived experience. And you complete the transformation from someone constantly affected by external chaos to someone completely untouchable by it. Machiavelli once wrote, "Where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great." Your willingness to become unaffected determines whether you will become unaffected. The path is clear. The principles are proven. The only question is whether you'll walk it. Nothing and nobody will affect you again. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you've mastered your response to it. Not because you don't care, but because you care strategically. Not because you're suppressing emotions, but because you've achieved sovereignty over them. You are no longer someone who gets affected. You are someone who chooses their state regardless of external circumstances. You are emotionally sovereign, psychologically invincible, and fundamentally free. If this video has shown you the path to becoming unaffected, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to stop letting everything disturb their peace. Subscribe to this channel because Machiavellian wisdom continues, and you need every principle to maintain your sovereignty. Now drop this final affirmation in the comments. Nothing and nobody controls my peace. Remember, the world will constantly try to affect you. That's what it does. People will provoke, circumstances will challenge, events will test you. But none of that matters because you've become someone who cannot be affected without choosing to be affected. Stay centered. Stay sovereign. Stay untouchable. This is who you are now.